etc. What he did was he sent a message to those on the ground that these acts can continue because you're going to have a legal curtain that you can hide behind for your illegal and immoral acts against other human beings. So when Chuck Todd refers to it as cable catnip, to hold those responsible that implemented a system of systematic torture, waterboarding one individual over 180 times, waterboarding another over 80 times, the sorts of systematic abuses that we saw at Abu Ghraib where prisoners were piled up naked. It's often referred to as sort of sexual humiliation of prisoners. If you read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, you'll understand that this is part of a psychology of forcing incredible regression on the part of human beings so that you essentially, in the words of Mao Zedong, you blank them. Blank is beautiful, and you try to recreate them in the image of a confessor to whatever crimes that you're putting forward. This whole system of torture, if we don't hold those accountable that dreamed it up, that provided the legal justification, that carried it out on the ground, we are going to continue to be a nation of torturers. And we're going to continue to be a nation of people who silently stand by and allow these criminal acts and immoral acts to be committed in the names of every person in this country. That is why it's not cable catnip. That is why it's a central issue. There's a reason why there were calls for accountability in South Africa for the white apartheid forces. It wasn't just about punishing people. The idea was that you're going to do it so that it never happens again. The Nuremberg principles never get discussed in US political culture except by activists who actually know what they're talking about, or human rights lawyers who actually know what they're talking about. Because the United States doesn't believe in a consistently applied system of international law. The United States believes in ad hoc war crimes tribunals for thuggish regimes like Milosevic or the butchers of Rwanda. The United States does not support an actual international criminal court that would have jurisdiction over US personnel for these crimes. That is one of the stains on the fabric of any democratic process in this country, the fact that it does not respect the same laws that other countries are expected by the United States to abide by. The United States has a policy of US exceptionalism when it comes to, particularly to war and questions of torture and occupations of other countries. So I was on this show with Chuck Todd, and before I came on the show, Chuck Todd and Jay Leno and Representative Jan Schakowsky were having a discussion, and media came up. And Chuck Todd was sort of speaking disparagingly about Glenn Beck. I'm all for that. I think Glenn Beck should have won the Emmy for Best Actress in a Comedy recently. But Chuck Todd made a statement that I thought was pretty telling. He said, well, this guy's not a journalist. I didn't invite him to the media club. And regardless of the fact that he's speaking about Chuck Todd, I found it very offensive that somehow Chuck Todd believes that he is sort of the king of journalism that can bestow upon others the right to be called a reporter or a journalist. Chuck Todd himself is not even a journalist, to tell the truth about it, if you look into his background. So when I went on the show, I was talking about Blackwater, and Chuck Todd sort of started to inject something by saying, well, we actually don't know who these people are. It shows his absolute ignorance on this issue. And I just turned to him and I said, you called it cable catnip, Chuck. The calls for accountability for Cheney and the other torturers, you stood there on national television and you called it cable catnip. And we sort of had a back and forth on the show. After the program ended, I was walking off the stage and sort of saying hi to the other people that were on the show, and Chuck Todd doesn't look at me, but he sort of cocks his head to the side and he goes, that was a really cheap shot. And we had gotten into other things too. I was saying, Helen Todd is really the only person on a consistent basis who raises any issues of importance on torture, on the wars, on a consistent basis. Sorry, what did I say? Helen Todd? Not Helen Todd. Helen Thomas. She's not related to Chuck Todd. When we were exiting the stage, though, Chuck Todd said that was a cheap shot, and I said, what was a cheap shot? And he said, just the whole thing. And he's kind of storming away, and Jay Leno was kind of like, whoa. And I sort of was going off, and Chuck Todd has his microphone on still, and he's kind of not paying attention. He's just like fleeing the scene. And I said, wait, Chuck, just tell me, what did I say on the show tonight that is not true? And he turns back around, and he kind of puts his hand on my shoulder like, you little punk. And he says to me, That's not the point. You sullied my reputation on television. That's a direct quote. You sullied my reputation on television. Chuck Todd does not need me to sully his reputation. He does a very good job of it himself on a regular basis. But what was telling about Chuck Todd's reaction, he could have easily on that show said, of course journalists could do a better job. Absolutely, these are questions that should be asked. But yet he acts like a gatekeeper. There are important issues that the cocktail parties have at the center of their discussions. And then there's the sort of fringe left that discusses these issues like torture that are so catnippy that we shouldn't even mention them on TV. And you see the mentality of these establishment journalists. They're friends with the powerful. They hang out with them on the weekends. They're each other's children's godparents. There's a culture where there is literally no overlap between the journalists that cover the White House and the people who work in the White House on these policies. And the stakes could not be higher now when you have a president that, despite some recent setbacks in terms of his popularity, remains wildly popular with many, many millions of Americans in this country. And the danger here with that is the line that's often taken by liberals, which is that you have to give Obama a chance. You have to back off and let him just do it, as though he actually was fooling people when he supported an expansion of the Afghan war, when he voted to extend sections of the Patriot Act, as though somehow he is some guy who has tricked the entire world into believing that he's going to be an establishment player, but really he's going to put forward an agenda that has at its absolute center policies based on social justice. I believe in looking at the actions of the powerful, not the words, although sometimes the words are the actions when it comes to filing legal briefs. The Obama administration has defended some of the most outrageous policies of the Bush administration in courts across this country. There's one recent memo that I want to talk about that is incredible, that was filed by Tony West, who's an assistant attorney general, works directly under Eric Holder. And it was in a case that was filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights on behalf of prisoners who died at Guantanamo. And Tony West, I'm going to read it here off of my little device. On June 26th, Holder's office intervened in a lawsuit that was filed by CCR against Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary, and 23 other military and medical officials for their role, and this is a quote, in the illegal detention, torture, inhumane conditions, and ultimate deaths of 2 Guantanamo prisoners. West cited the Westfall Act, which I mentioned last night, which allows the federal government to become the defendant in cases where individual federal employees are sued for their alleged crimes or torts against others. It was passed under the Reagan administration. And so Rumsfeld and these others appealed to Secretary Gates because they were being prosecuted in their capacity as DOD employees and asked him to have the Justice Department intervene, which is sort of the legal framework for doing this. And Holder's office did in fact intervene. And Tony West wrote this: the type of activities alleged against, this is a direct quote, the type of activities alleged against the individual defendants were, quote, foreseeable and were, quote, a direct outgrowth of their responsibility to detain and gather intelligence from suspected enemy combatants. This is Obama's Justice Department saying this. In defending the government's position, West cited case law stating, and this is a quote, that genocide, torture, forced relocation, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment by individual defendants employed by Department of Defense and State Department were within scope of employment. That is a direct quote. This was not filed by Alberto Gonzalez's office. It was not filed by Casey's office. This was filed by Attorney General Eric Holder's office. Let me repeat what they said is justifiable. Genocide, torture, forced relocation, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment by individual defendants employed by Department of Defense and State Department were within the scope of employment. Why is this not a national scandal? This takes it further than some of what we heard argued under the Bush administration. And there are attorneys in this room that have covered this from a legal perspective much more in depth than I have. But we here have the Obama Justice Department justifying genocide as a legal tactic as long as it's within the official scope of their